Okay, so welcome. My name is Rob Fitzpatrick.
My name is Paul Koufalis.
And we're from White Star Software, and we're going to talk to you about the basics of after imaging and the AI File Management Daemon, which is a big mouthful, so we'll probably just say AIMD from this point on.
I say AIMGT.
So, Paul, who's White Star?
Oh, boy. For over 30 years, we are the purveyors of ProTop. We help companies simplify the job of managing and monitoring your OpenEdge environments.
Yeah.
With ProTop, look at that. Wow. You think I planned that?
All right. So here's our agenda. We're going to talk about what is after imaging and some basics of the theory. We'll talk about why you should use AI in terms of the business motivations for doing that, which is a really important piece and is a requirement for your configuration. So we'll talk about how to configure, how to monitor, what recovery looks like, and then we'll have some discussion around retention of your archived AI files, and also some practical uses for after-image data beyond just the standard disaster recovery scenarios that you might associate with after-imaging. So, what is AI? It's a system of logging changes in the database to files that allows you to reapply those changes to a restored database to bring it up to date to a point in time. So in the case of many businesses, when they back up their data, that's just going to be a daily task. And so if you imagine that you don't have any other recovery facility apart from AI, that means if you crash 5 o'clock the next afternoon, you've lost everything from, let's say, your midnight daily backup until that crash. So that's obviously unacceptable in today's world, so you need to be running some sort of more robust recovery strategy than just backups, and that's why we're talking about AI. And the good news is it doesn't actually cost you anything other than your time. There's no licensing implication for using AI in production, and it's available with all database license levels. So, business considerations.
I'm the business guy. Listen, who's technical here? Who's management? Sort of, kind of. There's an English expression, CYA, which is cover your ass, okay? What does that mean? It means that these things we're about to talk about, RPO and RTO, it's not for the people in this room to decide. It's people who are at a higher pay grade than all of us who need to decide. So what's the recovery point? It's how much data can you afford to lose in a disaster? That's not our decision to make. That's the business's decision to make. And what's RTO? How long is it going to take you to recover from a disaster? And we'll show you later. We talk about always the big D disaster, fire and flood, and and total loss of your data center, but there's little d disasters that are much more frequent that could happen, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about some of those other things that AI helps you guard against. But the most important thing I want you to take away here is you need to go to management and say, how much data can we realistically afford to lose? And what's their answer going to be?
Nothing.
0. And then you're going to say, I need 4 million euros, and I can do that for you. And when you ask them, if we go down, how long should it take us to recover production? And the answer is going to be 0. And now I need 8 million euros, right? So somewhere along, I call it this, there's a cost-benefit curve, right? As the recovery time and the RPO and the RTO get shorter and shorter, like the costs get higher and higher exponentially. So somewhere in that curve, you'll find the sweet spot for your business. Oh, I can lose 15 minutes of data and I can be down for an hour. It's going to cost me, but I don't want to spend that next 100,000 euros, to get me down to 5 minutes or something like that. All right. But the most important thing is you need to get these values from management, and you need them in writing. It's not good enough in a conversation. You need them in writing, because I can guarantee you, I've been doing this for 30 years. I can guarantee you that when the shit hits the fan, it's going to be your fault. It's not going to be your manager's fault. It's not going to be the vice president's fault. It's going to be your fault. So make sure you have those numbers in writing, and that you reply to them and say, that's great. We're going to be down for 24 hours because you told me it was okay to be down for 24 hours. Who thinks here that their business can be down for 24 hours? Nobody. So
Right.
that's my public service announcement here.
Right. Yeah. And if they're not going to give it to you in writing, then probably when the disaster happens, you're going to be the scapegoat.
Yep.
So based on what they tell you about RPO, that's going to determine what your range of recovery options looks like. So you have some choices with OpenEdge. You could just do daily backups. For example, if they tell you that our RPO is 48 hours or it's some number of days, then yeah, you could probably get away with daily backups. But let's be realistic about this. How many people in today's world have a database that only changes, once a day, or only operates during 9 to 5 business hours? These days we have integrations with other applications and platforms. We have REST APIs. You have data coming in all the time. So realistically, I don't think anybody's in this situation anymore. You have to be doing more than backups. And as we'll see later on, this isn't just about recovering your data. AI has other benefits as well. So everything after that requires after imaging. If your RPO is 24 hours or less, that's what you want to be doing at a minimum. If your RPO is a small number of minutes, 5 minutes or less, then you're really looking at implementing OpenEdge Replication Plus, which also requires you to set up after imaging.
Is anybody using replication already? OpenEdge replication? No, that's interesting. Wow. Okay. A couple of people, yeah.
We're not going to be focusing on that too much, but there is a talk going on right now that Libor's doing about OpenEdge replication. So be sure to check out the YouTube recording of that.
Or come and see us at our booth. I mean, we've done so many million OpenEdge replication deployments that I can do it with my eyes closed. So if you have any questions about replication, just come and see us at the booth.
And I'm sure the folks at the Progress booth will be happy to help you too. It is an extra cost license, by the way. I should mention that. Whereas AI is free. So we'll talk about some of the basics from a theory perspective about the way that AI works. So this is all about changes happening in your database. So in the database, we have what's called a write-ahead logging rule, and that dictates the order in which change operations happen within the database. So a transaction starts, and the first thing that has to happen is that the notes that describe that change are written to the before image file. So this is the database's undo, redo log, and that's required both for durability of changes and also to facilitate crash recovery. After that, the changes are written to the AI area, assuming that AI is enabled. It is an optional feature, but we're assuming here that AI is enabled. And then after the changes are written to the AI area, then they're written to the blocks in the buffer pool. So all of that is essentially happening in memory, and then asynchronously, this data is being written out later to disk, to the BI file, to the AI file, and to the data extents as well. So that's part of the checkpoint process that commits the data to disk. So there's a difference, though, in the way that these files operate, the BI versus the AI. The database automatically manages space in the before image file. It's divided into units called clusters, and those get reused as the clusters empty out and no longer contain notes for active transactions. They can be reformatted and reused, so it's sort of a cyclical buffer. And when all is going well and your transactions are short, your BI doesn't grow. The AI doesn't work that way. You have multiple units of AI called AI extents, which are really areas. They're one extent areas. And once they're filled, they remain full until you intervene in some way. So they have to be archived and then marked as empty before you can reuse them. In the old days, we would have done that with scripting, but these days there's a better way, the AI MD, which we'll talk about later. So I mentioned the fact that we have multiple AI areas or extents. They're really one extent areas, so you can use the term synonymously in this case. And every extent has a status associated with it. And there are 4 possible statuses, and those are empty, busy, locked, and full. The locked status is specific to OE replication, so if you're not using that, you could ignore that status. An empty extent is ready to be used, but is not being written to yet. There's only ever one extent being written to at a time, and that's the busy extent. So if you see an extent list and there's one marked as busy, that's where the notes are going right now. Once that extent fills, or we switch away from it to go to the next extent, then the previous one is marked as full, the next empty one gets changed to a busy status, and then it keeps going like that. With the locked status, what that means is it's a full extent whose notes have not yet been replicated to the replication targets. Once all the notes in that extent get delivered to the targets, then the status changes from locked to full. And then at that point, it can be archived and marked as empty again. So here's a little diagram to illustrate what that's like. So we have a client that's going to make some changes. The BI and AI notes are going to be written. So we write to AI file number 1 until it's full, then AI file number 2 until it's full, et cetera, until they're all full. So if we didn't do any archiving, that's what this would look like. And once you're out of extents, there's nowhere to write the notes, and the database can't continue processing changes. So now what? Well, you have to archive. So once a file is full, you have to archive it, make a copy of it, put it in a safe location, ideally on your DR server. So you don't want to just archive it to a different directory on prod, because if prod goes up in smoke, you've lost your recovery files as well as your database. So that's not a good idea. So what you have to do is copy the file, verify that the copy got to the safe location, and then you run a command to mark it as empty so that the database knows, okay, that can be put into the queue of AI extents that can be reused to get more notes.
And that's a really key point. You want to get those archived AI files ideally out of the same city, right? The whole point of having AI files is if there's a disaster, you can recover the backup, and you can recover and then roll forward these AI files so that you don't lose any changes to the database, right, until the point of those AI files, or the point in time. But if you're storing everything on the same SAN and you lose power in your data center or whatever, your room where the servers are, well, guess what? You don't have access to the backups, and you don't have access to the AI archives either. So you need to immediately get them off the box. Don't wait until tonight's backup process to take the backup files and the AI archives and send them to tape. It should be like every 15 minutes or whatever, you're looking, are there any archived AI files? Yes, let me copy them to the DR site. Or if you're using tape backup or whatever it is you're using for backups, you got to get those archives off of the production box. In fact, like I said, ideally out of the same data center that's where you're running production.
Yeah, that's an important point, because if anyone here from North America? If you remember 2003, we had a blackout that affected basically the entire eastern seaboard for several days. If you've got, your production site uptown and your DR site downtown in the same city, well, everybody was dark in that scenario. Doesn't happen often, but it illustrates that it can happen. So that geodiversity is important to implement.
And that's where the, 1,000, 100,000, 1 million, 4 million cost comes in, right? Because the more protected your business requires you to be, the higher the costs are, right? If I tell you you have a data center in Prague and you must have now a data center in New York City, right? That's you're on 2 different continents. Now you're paying for black fiber across the ocean so that you can ship logs and do whatever it is you need to do, right? Obviously, those costs are going to be insanely high, but if that's what your business requires, that's what they have to pay for, right? But maybe it's good enough to put one in Prague and one in London, or maybe it's good enough to put one in Prague and one in, I don't know, whatever, some other city here in I don't know, what's another city here in Czech? I don't know, Prague and...
Welcome to Paul's geography quiz.
Okay. Sorry? Berlin. That's not in Czech either. Thank you very much. Okay, it's not far. Don't try to fool me. I know I'm bad in geography, but even I know Berlin's not in Czech.
Okay, so why are we doing this, Paul?
Why are we doing this? It always comes back to management. We're doing this to satisfy a business requirement. And again, I keep stressing it. It is not a technical requirement. It's not a DBA requirement. It's a business requirement. And if the business doesn't tell you what the requirement is, whatever happens, it's going to be your fault. Okay, just be aware of that, right? And in 2024, it's not like 20 years ago where you're like, oh, we'll restore last night's backup. We'll pull the pile of papers out and Bob and Susie are going to sit down and start typing the orders back in. It doesn't exist anymore, right? You don't even know where the orders are coming from, from some Sonic MQ channel and from the web and some REST interface and whatever this data is coming into your system. There is no paper trail. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. And like we said earlier, it's not just the big D disaster. There's little things we'll talk about that could happen. You could just screw up, and this has happened. I've seen this. Developer, this screen is development, this screen is production. And he said, for each customer, delete customer. Guess which screen he was in, right? So what's a little D disaster? We restored backup. We rolled forward AI files, right? We actually had a warm spare going. We'll talk about warm spares. We dumped the customer table out of the warm spare, loaded into production. We were down for half an hour, essentially, right? Because he deleted all the freaking customers. That's why developers aren't allowed in prod anymore, okay? And the last point here is really important because, again, 10 or 20 years ago, if we turn on AI, we don't have the disk space to store the archives. If we turn on AI, it's going to affect performance. It's terrible. None of that exists anymore. So there is no more cost, really, to enabling AI. So obviously, if the cost is almost zero and the benefit is almost infinite, it's not hard to do the math that you should be using AI. And you'll notice neither Rob or I asked who's not using AI.
I was thinking about it, but I didn't.
Exactly.
No shaming here.
No shame. We're all friends. It's a safe room here. Oh. Go ahead.
Benefit isn't the infinite. So if the benefit would be infinite, then the AI is the one that everyone should use it.
Yes, everyone should use it.
Infinite, but it isn't. So it is limited, and saying cost of the AI is still there. So we can't say it's just.
Okay. Semantics here.
Okay.
The cost is low and the benefit is very high. And we're nearing the asymptotic point of infinity on both ends, but we didn't quite reach it. But
if you have a disaster and you can't recover enough data that business continuity is even possible, then you're no longer having a discussion about benefits and costs and budgets.
You're out of business.
You're updating your resume.
Yeah.
Right? And you're maybe getting sued in the process, depending on what your rank is. So Paul mentioned hot spare and warm spare. So just to put some definitions around those terms, these are different levels of preparedness for your disaster recovery system. So we define a cold spare database as one that doesn't exist persistently in your DR environment, but you're just going to build it as needed when that disaster happens. So it's a very reactive strategy. So you're going to take last night's backup and you're going to restore it, and then you're going to try to do something with it and maybe turn it into prod, or maybe ship that data back to the prod site if it's not a smoking crater, and try to recover from that. You might even have to pull in tapes from Iron Mountain or wherever you're storing them in a vault. So it's not necessarily an immediate thing where you're just going to get in an SSH session and copy a file. You might be requisitioning a tape and waiting days for that. So, this is why it's not a reliable strategy, if it's data that you really care about. So a warm spare is probably what you're going to be looking at as a minimum. And what this involves is having a database on your DR system, and then you're doing what we call log shipping, AI log shipping. So what that means is you're taking your archived AI extents as they're being archived, not as a once-a-day batch process, but as they're being archived, written to your local archive on prod. You're also going to copy them over to your safe location, and then you can apply those on an ongoing basis to the warm spare database, so it's being continually brought up to date, one file at a time. So if you're switching files every 15 minutes, for example, then every 15 minutes you apply a new file that applies 15 minutes worth of database changes and brings that database more and more up to date.
Now, we mentioned earlier that the AI functionality is free. That's included in Enterprise Database Workgroup. But if you want to maintain a warm spare, that may require additional licenses. It depends how you're licensed in OpenEdge, right? So if you're going to do that and you need additional licenses, I would say it's usually more economical to just purchase OpenEdge Replication Plus than to buy licenses that allow you to maintain a warm spare. So even if you decide to maintain warm spare with AI log shipping, you might purchase OpenEdge Replication Plus licenses. And again, come see me afterwards if you want to, dig into that in more detail.
Licensing is a whole other complicated discussion point, and there are a lot of different ways that it's done. There isn't just one way that licensing is done in the Progress world. Another thing I would say about replication is if you already have an advanced enterprise database license, the good news is you already have Replication Plus and all of the other database add-on products for free. It's a fantastic deal. So if you're using enterprise and any number of add-ons like replication, TDE, multi-tenancy, table partitioning, I strongly encourage you to talk to your sales rep and look into that. So the final definition, a hot spare, that's where you're maintaining a database with OpenEdge replication, and it's going to be near real time, so a matter of seconds behind your prod database.
And you'll notice we talk about Replication Plus all the time. The difference between replication, OpenEdge replication, and OpenEdge Replication Plus is that the Plus license allows you to query the target database in read-only, and the replication license alone does not. It is dumb that the two licenses are offered. You should never buy replication. If you're going to buy it, buy Replication Plus. Huge advantage to be able to offload data extractions, queries, reporting onto your replication target database.
Yeah, it's Plus is a little more, but it's so worth it.
Of course, yeah.
So there are other types of replication that you're going to encounter in your business, and you might get someone from your IT department telling you about how wonderful their technology of the week is. Hey, you don't have to worry about this AI thing or your database backups because we have...
Yeah, AutoMagic.
We have RAID X for some value of X. We have SAN mirroring, or we have site-to-site SAN replication, or we have VM snapshots, or we have Veeam, or it's others like that, or we have file system replication, and we'll just replicate the file system that your database is on, and you'll be good.
We had a customer here in Europe, this was last year, who it did exactly that. They said, we don't need replication because we just bought this fancy real-time disk file system replication utility, and it keeps this real-time sync between, our primary server here and our secondary server there, except it didn't work. Like, it was locking files up, the database would crash, even though they promised them that it never locks files and it never does any of these things. Well, guess what it did? They ran it for 2 months, and then they're like, okay, we can't be crashing every 3 days because of this stupid software. They pulled it out, and we put in Replication Plus. So,
right. Yeah, and what you need to remember about the database is that your database state isn't just in your database files, it's also the changes that are in shared memory. So your files are always a little bit stale, a little bit out of date, and these technologies don't understand the database and don't know how to synchronize changes the way ProBackup does. So you need to be using ProBackup, you need to be using AI, because you can run a test with VMware snapshots or whatever else on a sports database that's not doing anything, and put it over here and start it up and go, oh yeah, it works fine. It looks like it works, but if you try that in prod, eventually you'll get burned, and it's not going to work. And there's no easy way out of that.
No.
So that's why you should do it, and why you should not do some other things. So let's talk about how to set this up. So let's imagine we have a database, but we don't have AI enabled. How do we get from unprotected to protected? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a structure addition file that has AI extents defined in it. Now, this could lead into a whole religious discussion about fixed extents versus variable length extents, and I don't think we have time to go into all the whys and wherefores about that. There are legitimate cases, I would say, for each one, and I know of people who evangelize one versus the other. I would say that fixed extents require more oversight and management, and you can run into more problems with those that you won't run into with variable.
Yeah, I just put variable everywhere. I would say, like, if I look at we monitor almost 10,000 databases with ProTop, and if 1% of them are using fixed length extents, I would be surprised. I mean, the use cases for fixed length AI extents are microscopic, and as technology advances, as disks get faster and systems get faster, those use cases are just dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. So really, unless you think you have some special magical environment, you can use variable length extents.
Yeah, and I would say in particular, if you're new to this, you're just implementing AI, do yourself a favor and use variable. Your life will be easier. So once you define a set of extents, the minimum that you require realistically is 4, but I like to do, let's say, 16 extents. So you put those in a file, and then you apply them to a database. You can do this either online or offline. So this is a prostruct add or a prostruct add online. You can see the commands there. And then we're going to go through the process of enabling after imaging in the database. So this is turning on the feature in the database. So it's a process of first backing up the database. You do also have the option of marking it as backed up if you've just done a backup recently. Then you enable after imaging with this command. So rfutil is the family of commands that you're going to use to manage the life cycle of after imaging. So it's rfutil dbname minus big C A image begin. And then because we don't want to do manual scripting of the archiving of the extents, and we want to use the AI File Management Daemon, AIMD, or AIMGT, whatever, then you're going to run this command, AI Archiver enable.
And just to clarify, we'll show you how to do this online in just a couple of slides, okay? We're showing you the offline method first. That's the way we used to do it, but you can do all of this without ever shutting the database down.
Right, so the next step, having done that offline, is that you're going to start your database. There are a few parameters that you can specify that are specific to this. So we've got AI arc interval and AI arc dir. So this is the directory that's a required parameter. So that says where should the AIMD copy the files to? What is that safe location that it's going to put the files in? So you can specify one directory. You can also specify a comma-separated list. And what's going to happen if you specify a list is it'll always write to the first location as long as it can. But if anything happens to that location, like it's on a volume that runs out of space, or it goes away, somebody renames it or deletes it, it'll take the next directory in the list and it'll keep going. So it won't fail. So it gives you some measure of protection, although you do have to keep an eye on that. And then the interval says this is a measure of seconds. What is the interval between switches from one extent to the next? So at the end of every interval, the daemon will close the current busy extent, mark it as full, take the next empty extent, change it to busy, and then the new notes can be written to the new busy extent. And then it'll archive the full extent to the archive directory.
And this is really your RPO if you're maintaining a warm spare, right? If you can lose 15 minutes of data, then you rotate, you archive every 15 minutes, and that way your warm spare is, at any point in time between 0 and 15 minutes behind production, essentially.
Yeah, the other important point here is that, as you probably know, there are helper or background processes in the database. There's the BI writer that offloads the task of flushing BI buffers out to the BI file. There's an analogous process for after imaging. It's the AI writer or AIW. So you're going to add this to your database startup process, pro AIW. That'll start an mpro shut process, which implements the AI writing functionality. So you always want to have that process connected whenever you're running AI. It's just an efficiency measure.
And AIW, BIW, watchdog, you can only have one, right? So there's not a question of only the asynchronous page writers, APW. Can you potentially run more than one, though you probably never need to run more than one, but that's another religious discussion that we can have.
Yeah, but at a minimum, you want those four.
Yeah, you want the four
helper processes running at all times.
Exactly.
Okay. Also, one other point I didn't mention yet is that comma-separated list can be either an absolute path or a relative path. If it's a relative path, it's relative to the database directory. But typically, you're going to specify an absolute path.
And the other thing, we said earlier that we want, as soon as you archive that AI file, we want you to ship it off the box somewhere else. And so you're probably the first thing you're thinking is, hey, I'll NFS mount or Samba mount a volume, and then I'll tell the AI archiver to archive to the NFS mount. And look, I killed two birds with one stone. Don't do that.
Sounds like a great idea. In practice, we've both been burned.
Yes.
And we don't do it anymore. Because if that NFS mount goes stale, the AIMD is just going to stall. And then I've had to bounce a customer's database during the day because it stalled, and that caused a feedback effect into the database, and the database stopped working, essentially.
Right, because the AI archiver will take a latch at some point to mark that AI file as empty and to archive it, and it takes the latch, and then it goes to do the write, and then it hangs on the NFS write, but it's holding the latch, and nobody can work, essentially, in the database anymore. And then if you try to kill the AI writer holding the latch, crashes the database. So that's it. There's nothing you can do. You have to crash the database to get out of that. So please write to a local directory and then script something that will take that and then FTP it or whatever to somewhere else.
Yeah, so you could set up some watchdog script or cron job that's just going to look in your archive directory and see, do I have a file there? Okay, I do. Copy it over and keep emptying out that local directory. So you can do this offline with the steps that we just showed, but in 10.1b and later, which hopefully everybody's on, you can do this all with one command, a pro backup command, which looks like this. So it's a pro backup online, and then we have these keywords. You can do enable AI archiver if they aren't already enabled, and then specify the parameter values And so you don't have to bring your database down to implement this. So all of this can be done completely online.
You forgot to put -com on this one.
Did I forget?
You forgot to put -com on this one.
I forgot. Yeah.
Okay. Use -com.
Use -com on your backup.
Yeah.
But this isn't a pro backup set.
Okay.
If you're on a very recent release, in 12.7 and later, you don't have to take a backup to enable the AIMD. This is a feature request that was outstanding for a while, and it's really important if you have a huge database, if you have a 2 terabyte database or something like that, running Pro Backup is pretty invasive. It involves a lot of I/O, and it's going to take a lot of time just to really set a flag inside the database to say, start the AI daemon. So with this enhancement, you can now turn it on directly with this rfutil AI archiver enable command, and again, specify the parameter values without having to do a backup. Question?
What's the use of those AI files if you do not have a valid backup?
Okay, so you always need backups. That's a given, right? So this is not an alternative to a backup. It's a way to empower you to recover in a more granular way, a more flexible way with your backups. So backups are the foundation of after imaging. So
But this option enables AI archiver
Yeah,
without
so-
having a.
right. So if you had AI,
So those AI files are useless if you do not have a recent backup to roll forward them to.
well, the assumption is you're always backing up your database. Let's say once a day.
No, I think here, sorry. What happens is you might have been archiving the AI extents manually with your scripting, and then you hadn't implemented the automatic AI archiver utility, and then you decide to switch from scripted rotation to the automatic rotation. And in the past, you had to do a full backup to do that, which is really painful if you have a terabyte database. Now you can just say enable for this. But to answer your direct question, an AI file without a backup has no value. You must, and in fact, not only a backup, it has to be, you need the backup, and you need from the very first AI file after that backup. And we'll talk about that in the recovery section later.
Right.
So you can enable the archiver, but then you still need a backup shortly after that to be able to.
And so be careful. Once we enabled AI, not the archiver, once we enabled after imaging, we started generating after imaging. And you cannot enable after imaging until you take a backup. So there is an obligatory daisy chain. You must back up first. You must enable AI second, and then you can, if you want, enable the AI archiver.
Right. Yeah, because AI has been around for a long, long time, but the archiver's only been around since 10.1a. So obviously people were doing AI before it existed. Okay, so your extent switching, we've already talked about the daemon doing that for you. There are different ways that this can happen. So you can set up the daemon with an AI arc interval, and that can be any value from 2 minutes up to 24 hours. Doesn't really make sense to do more than 24 hours because you're probably backing up every 24 hours. So you want to be doing switches within the backup interval. You can also, if you use fixed length extents, there's going to be a switch from one file to the next automatically when the previous file fills. And that's specific to fixed length, obviously, because variable ones are just going to grow and grow. You can do an on-demand switch. So this would have been more popular in the past when people are scripting this sort of thing with the rfutil image new command. So that'll trigger a manual switch. And anytime you back up your database, that's also going to cause a switch. And the final one is if you do a pro-quiet enable. So if you set a quiet point in the database, let's say to do something like a VM snapshot, which is safe to do after you've enabled a quiet point, that's also going to cause an AI extent switch.
So a lot of customers that have very large databases, the backup, the pro backup didn't become multi-threaded until 12.8 essentially, or 7.
About 12.5?
5, okay.
5 or 6, yeah.
5, 6, 7. But in the past, it wasn't multi-threaded. And if you have a multi-terabyte database and you're backing it up single-threaded, that would take an extremely long time. So what they would do is they would pro-quiet, split the mirror, essentially, then unquiet the database, continue production on one side of the mirror, and then use an actual backup tool to do a multi-threaded file backup of that now quiesced database, and then do your sync mirror VG afterwards when you bring the mirrors back together. So that's why people were doing this quite a bit when they had large databases, so they could do multi-threaded backups.
Okay, so this is just a bit of review. We've already touched on this. So the AI ArcDir, these are the broker parameters that you can specify related to AI. The AI ArcDir is where we're going to copy the files. Again, make sure it's a local file system. The AI arc interval is the time interval between rotations if you're doing it on a timed basis. And we'll show you in a little bit in the monitoring section how you can tell how you're configured right now. There's a third parameter that you can specify. I don't typically use this, which AI ArcDir create. If the AI ArcDir directories that you specify don't exist, then the daemon will create them.
Yeah, and we don't like this because, I mean, if there's a mistake in the spelling of the AI ArcDir, I want you to fix the mistake in the spelling of the AI ArcDir. I don't want to randomly create a folder. And if there's something else wrong, a file system isn't mounted properly and the directory doesn't exist, if there's something wrong, I want this to fail. I don't want it to try to fix itself, because chances are it's going to fix itself in a way that I'm not going to like. So I don't like the AI ArcDir create parameter. And for the AI arc interval, you know, Rob said it's from 2 minutes to 24 hours, but the reality is, like, nobody's rotating like longer than 15 minutes now, right? Longer than 15 minutes just doesn't make any sense to me, right? There's no reason to rotate every 4 hours or every 8 hours. Just rotate every 15 minutes. It's just going to generate more smaller files. It's not a big deal, right? So I would say 15 minutes is, for me, kind of the longest interval for AI rotations.
Okay, we're going to have to move it along because we're running short on time.
Oh, good.
Okay, so here's some more rfutil commands. You can, once you set these values for the directory and the interval, you can also change them online with these commands, and they'll take effect right away, essentially. So if you are taking a scripted approach, this is something that you can do to, let's say, cut down on the number of files that you have during a low business period, weekends, holidays, for example, and then you could potentially increase the interval during very busy times. If you want to stop the daemon, then it's AI archiver disable. So that's going to permanently stop it. If you want to temporarily stop it, then you can use AI archiver end.
And there's no AI archiver begin or pro AIMD for some reason. I don't know why they never added this functionality. So if you do stop it temporarily and you're like, oh, let me look in the documentation, how do I restart it? There is no documentation. You have to actually type the full command out yourself, which is a proshut sports -c AIMGT and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so you can see, you know, a process list from a database. It looks similar to the command lines that you have for the other helper processes.
Yeah.
During applying scheme changes, it's not necessary to stop the archive.
No, schema changes will go right through the AI files. Same thing with replication. Schema changes go right through.
Because a schema change is a data change. It's a change to the metadata in your schema files. So if you want to see how the archiver is configured at the moment, it's a database feature, so it's listed in this table of database features in a pro-util describe, and you'll either see timed and the interval here. If you're using an AI arc interval, if you're not, it'll say on demand 0. So how to monitor and what to monitor. So these are the things that you want to be looking for on an ongoing basis. If you take one thing away from this, other than the fact that you should all be using AI, it is that you need to monitor AI once you're using it. because it can be pretty painful if you don't do that. So you want to look at your AI extent statuses, and we'll tell you what to look for. Make sure that these processes are running, and also make sure that you understand which directory you're writing to for archiving. So we talked about the extent statuses. You want almost all of your extents at any one time to be in the empty status, meaning they're ready to be written to. If you have more than one locked or full extent for any meaningful period of time, that warrants investigation, because it means switching is not happening as it should be. Something is causing this process to not work as it should. You should have some sort of monitoring alerting on this so that you're aware that it's going on. You can add more extents if you need to, but you need to catch the problem in time.
And that's why we talk about 16 extents, right? So if you've put monitoring and you're like, alert me if I have more than 2 full extents, right? So you're like, 1, I understand. 2 might be for, like you said, a short period of time. 3 doesn't make any sense. So you can put alerting and say, if I have more than 3 full extents, or less than 12 empty extents, alert me. Why? Because if I'm rotating every 15 minutes, then I've got 12 times 15 minutes. I've got some time to figure out what the problem is and solve the problem. So give yourself that time. Alert early for this problem.
Right. So at the command line, you can do an rfutil image list, and it'll give you a stanza like this for every extent. So this is the information about one extent. So we see here the line that says status busy. That's what you want to look for. And so if you have 16 extents, you'll see 16 stanzas like this, and check each of the status. So you could do this command pipe grep status, and then you'll see all of the statuses that way. If you want to do it programmatically, that's possible in 11.7 or later. You can use the area status VST and filter on the AI status type, and it'll just show you your AI areas. So this is an example of a database with 4 AI extents, just so it fits on the slide. And we can see again, we've got 3 empty and 1 busy. So that looks good. If you want to monitor for whether the AIMD and the AIW are running, you can do that programmatically, because these are database connected processes. Therefore, they have a record in the _connect VST, like all database processes do. So this is a simple query that will look for the connect type, AIMD or AIW, and just show that you've got these 2 connected. You could also look at promon11, which is exactly the same data, just without the query. Or if you want to do it from the command line again, you can do something like, munge your process list and filter out the lines that say AIMGT, not AIMD, and AIW. Yes, it's not consistent, but it is what it is. In a ProShut, if you do a ProShut list, which lists all of your connections, it actually filters out the AIMGT. It doesn't show it. So you can look for your AIW this way, but not the daemon.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't tell you that ProTop does all of this automatically. So please come and see us at the ProTop booth.
But it's not a sales talk, so we're not going to dwell on that.
I had to throw it in. Come on.
This is an example of some log messages. So I had in this test database AI archive directories A, B, C, and D. And then I deleted directory A. So it was writing archived A extends to A, and then I deleted it. And then I get this message, from this point forward, all extents will be written to B. So if the directory goes away and then I restore it and it's now available again, doesn't matter. The AMD will never try to write to it again. It'll only go forward in its comma-separated list, never backwards. So if you've got a list of directories, make sure you're paying attention to messages like this in your DB log, so that you know that the files are no longer going to be where you expected them to be. And here's some other messages that you might see, like if you run out of space. Again, it's going to do a switch if it can. If you only have one ARCtor, it's just going to say, can't switch. It's going to try every time, but it's going to fail every time. So make sure you monitor your database log for messages like this.
Yeah, we're good. Thanks.
Okay, so back to what I was saying earlier about how critical it is to monitor. If you run out of empty extents, that's a bad thing. One of two things will happen. If you're using variable length extents, so at this point you've got all full extents and the last one is busy, it'll keep writing to the busy one as long as it can. Now, how long that is depends on A, your transaction volume, B, whether you have large file support enabled or not. If you don't, your maximum extent size is 2 gigs. If you do, it's 1 terabyte. You don't want to have a terabyte's worth of data in an AI extent because that could be a month or 6 months of data or more.
Or until you run out of disk space.
Right. And in the smoking crater scenario where you don't get that last extent, you've just lost 6 months of data and all you've got is your backups. So you need to be paying attention to the switches and make sure that you've got enough empty extents. Another scenario that I've seen is, if you run out of empty extents, and as we said earlier, backups cause extent switches. Well, if you can't switch, you can't do a backup, right? So that means if you're out of extents and you don't notice, and you've got an automated backup script that runs every night, your backups will fail. And so if let's say your DR strategy is you're populating a warm spare database with your last night's backup, and you've stopped refreshing that and haven't noticed, now basically your DR plan is torn to shreds. You don't have a recovery position, you don't have your latest changes, and you're in a world of hurt.
And you don't know how many times we've seen that, where we come into a customer and, I don't know, whatever, something happened and we look and they haven't had a backup in 6 months, 3 months. Like, we see this all the time, right? And they're like, your backups haven't worked in 3 months? Oh, really? Wow, no, we didn't know that.
Because it's set it and forget it. The automated day one, it works great, and then you never look at it again.
Exactly.
So don't do that. Okay, so how to recover. So recovering with AI, this process is called rolling forward. So the starting point is you have a database backup. You're going to restore that to create a backup, which is your database as at the time that backup began, whenever it was. Could be yesterday, could be last week, could be last month. And then you can roll forward the AI extents that were created from the time of the start of that backup. So again, a backup causes an extent switch. So you're going to have a brand new extent with the same time as the beginning of that backup. If you have that extent and every extent since, you can apply the changes in those AI extents and bring that restored database further and further up to date, closer to being current. So if you want to, I'm missing a command apparently. If you want to restore, roll forward one extent, then it's rfutil minus big C roll forward -A and then the name of the archived extent file. And then if you want to you can also do a list of AI extents. So you can have a file that contains a list of extent names and then say -AI list, and then it'll just apply all of those files at once. So if you're doing a roll forward of lots of files, don't worry about trying to write a big, huge script with 100, roll forward commands. Just do one roll forward command and specify a list file. This is also more efficient because every time you roll forward a file, you're doing a redo process. You're doing basically crash recovery in that database. So if you do the list, you're only doing that crash recovery once instead of n times for the n extents you're rolling forward. But you don't just have to apply an entire file and all of the changes in it. This is the flexibility that I talked about earlier. You can roll forward to a point in time. So if a file goes from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock on a particular day, you could roll forward to 2:37, right? Because let's say somebody did a really bad thing and the developer mistakenly deleted all the customers. You can roll forward to right up to that point if you know that time. Or if you've scanned your AI logs and you know a transaction ID, you can be even more granular. You can say roll forward up to this transaction number so that you can catch up as much data as possible, lose as little data as possible, and not apply the poison change to your restored database. Okay, so a couple more topics.
Sorry, one thing we missed.
Yes.
How do we find the first extent?
How do you find? Well, the easiest thing to do is guess. Because
Yes.
if you try to apply the wrong extent first to a restored backup, nothing bad will happen. It won't apply the changes. It won't screw you up. The database will just say, oh, you gave me file number 11. I wanted file 37. So you get file 37, and you roll forward, and you move on to 38, 39, etc. All fine. Just guess. You can also look in a file called archival.log, which is in the database directory. This is written to by the AI daemon. I didn't mention it. It's in the docs, but that's another way you can get this data.
Or in the database log file is there too.
Right.
So theoretically, I could just take a huge list of every file I have until the first command is successfully.
No, we do one, and it's the wrong one, and then it tells you, okay, this is the first one, and then you go from the first one to the last one, and you put those file names in a text file, and you say rfutil roll forward AI list, the text file, right? And if by some chance you got lucky and you picked the right one, well, that'll roll forward, and then your list is from the next one,
Right.
Which has happened to me. I have guessed the right one before.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's no harm in trying and getting the
Right.
wrong one. Okay, so file retention. I've talked to a lot of customers who, they have a process where, let's say, they restore a backup every night onto a test system, and then they back up their AIs, and they're very confident in that process, and they only keep 4 to 7 days worth of files, and then they delete their AI files. I think that's insane, because these files are relatively small, they compress very well, and disk space is dirt cheap. And this is really, it's a business decision, right? You're making a trade-off between the cost of how many resources you want to spend to keep these AI files and the time you want to spend on recovery, because if you're backing up to tape or to something off-site, it might take a long time to get the data back, as opposed to keeping it in online storage like hard drives. And you just have more recovery options if you have more files, because let's say last night's backup isn't good, it got truncated. Well, now you need the backup from the day before and all the AI files from the day before or the week before. I had a customer, just quick story, who the IT guy noticed that the system time was wrong by 30 seconds, so he thought, oh, I'll just type a command to change that. And he put it forward 30 seconds, except, oops, he used the wrong syntax and put his system time ahead 30 days. And all the month-end reports ran, and his database, while physically fine, was logically corrupt beyond repair. It was going to take us weeks to try to programmatically fix it, and he called us and we said, shut down your database, restore last night's backup, roll forward your AIs, and you'll lose minimal data. And he went, okay. And we said, what? And then we found out that his backups hadn't run for 6 months, and he didn't notice. Fortunately, he had an archive of all of his AI extents from the time he enabled AI, which included back to 6 months ago. He restored a 6-month-old backup, rolled forward 6 months worth of files, and he lost like 2 minutes of data. If he didn't have even one of those files, he'd be out of business. That's how critical this is. How much money would you be willing to spend to save the life of your business when you can buy a 4 terabyte hard drive for $50? Give me a break. Keep your files. Okay, I think we're at the last slide. Yay.
Yeah. I think we talked at the beginning of the talk about big D disasters, but there's a lot of usefulness beyond the big D disaster, right? The one that I've seen the most really is like feeding a reporting DB when you don't have replication, or refreshing dev, test, and UAT. But some of the less common ones I've seen is we've had the government come in to do a tax audit, and so the business came to us and they said, we need a copy of the database from March 31st, whatever year at exactly this time, because that was our end of fiscal quarter and were being tax audited by the government. So we had to go and restore and roll forward to that point in time. I've also had, and he's had this happen also too, where there were questions about changes to the data and who might have made the changes to those data and what changes were made and were they legal to make. And so we've rolled forward, to last week at 3:42 p.m. because that's when we think somebody changed something. And then there's a thing called AI scan verbose here where you can actually start looking at changes. It's ugly. You don't want to do this, but you can go down to a very granular visibility into those AI files and see that, Jonathan changed this data at this time, for example. And you can do that with auditing if you have auditing enabled, but using AI, you could roll forward to before the change and say, until this time, the data was this value, and that's when the data changed.
Right. And if you're, this could be something that happened months ago. It might be at a time when you only have your monthly backups at this point. So if someone wants to know what happened on the 5th of the month, well, you don't know because you have the 31st of the last month and the 31st of the next month. You can't tell what happened on the 5th. But if you have the previous month's backup and the AI files up to that point in time, you can restore very granularly, even minute by minute, to see what changes were made to what blocks, by what users, with what transaction IDs. There's a ton of data in that AI scan verbose output.
And again, it's a business decision, right? You ask the business, if you need to restore something from 3 months ago, is it good enough that I have only the first of the month or the last of the month? No, that's not good enough. Well, what's good enough? I need the daily backups. Okay, I'm going to keep dailies for a year, but is it okay that I can't restore to March 4th at 2 p.m.? Is that okay? That's fine. Okay, get it to me in writing. Of course, you need to have it in writing from the business that's what their expectation is. And then you can turn back and say, that's great. I need 10 terabytes of disk space to store all these backups, right? And if they don't give you the disk space, you say, well, I can't satisfy your business requirement. Are we done? Questions?
Is it possible to roll forward in an incremental way so that you can say roll forward to the moment in time X, Y, Z? Take a look at the data, make your snapshot or whatever you want to take or look at, and then say roll forward so the rest, or 1 minute more, or something like that?
Yeah, so the question is, can we roll forward to a point in time, look, and then roll forward a little more, look, and roll forward a little more? The answer is yes, but you have to connect to the database with -RO, read only, right? If you connect in RO, you don't touch the database, but you can query the database in RO, and then you can do a roll forward retry, which will apply the same file to a little bit further in time.
Yeah, once you open a database that you've been rolling forward to, it's no longer a roll forward target, right? So you have to be careful about how you open it. So that read only is an exception to that rule. But if you were to start the database with start it in multi-user mode and connect a client to it, you can't roll forward anymore. So what you could do is, roll forward, make a copy of the database, open the copy, right? And then you could still, roll forward more files to the target.
One thing we didn't mention, which is relatively new and not a lot of people use it, but in 11.7 there's an RFutil or ProUtil oplock, and then in 12 there's a DB restrict, and those are really important. They're useful parameters to use, and you can say DB restrict the database to only allow roll forwards. And why? Because if you're doing this and then your buddy here comes in and look, a database, let me start it, and then you're like, no, I got to start all over again. So you can restrict the database so no one can accidentally open it while you're doing these roll forward operations.
Right.
Other questions? You guys can come and see us at the booth if you have questions about replication or AI or anything else or Protop. Come and see us.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the conference.